the highest achieving ethnic group in Britain. 75% of Chinese children have gained at least 5 A-star to C passes at GCSE, which compares to only 51% of white children. And they're actually very successful as well at getting into post-compulsory education. So over 90% of British Chinese students continue into university, which is, again, more than any other ethnic group in Britain.
I mean, that is an extraordinary number, 90%
Yes.
going on, isn't it?
It is.
You know, if you hear the government talking about their aims, and they're talking about 50% being an absolutely high number, but here's 90% going. But afterwards, what about afterwards? Does this mean to say that they take their degrees, they go into higher education, they then move into professional positions?
Well, the British Chinese, they are very successful in getting into professional jobs, but I think there's still an issue that once they're there seems to be a bit of a concrete ceiling. They're towards the lower end of the professional scales. It's not a complete success story.
So, and that's not related to the class of degrees or anything they get. You would feel that this is something to do with some form of implicit discrimination going on.
Yes, absolutely.
What are the factors which produce this very high achievement? What you talk about it being related to their identity in some ways. Explain that to me.
Yes, we found that all the young people and the parents that we talked to really they talked about valuing education as a really core aspect of their identities. It wasn't just that they thought education, oh, well, it's a good thing, we like it. Yeah. They actually talked about it as something that defines their British Chineseness.
And this is a pretty competitive environment, isn't it? Competitive between Chinese families.
Yes, we found that social competition was an important driver of success. So families and young people would talk about how they would be compared with their cousins or their siblings, for example, in terms of what grades they're getting, like who's got the best grades or what school you've got into or what university and so on.
Yeah, yes. And then in terms of producing the type of conditions which would help their children to achieve, I mean, the phrase like cultural capital, but all the, as it were, all those various elements of life that they might have seen as assisting their children in their endeavours, that they tried to provide these as well.
Yes, I mean, at a basic level, families would often talk about aspirations in the future from a very young age, so it became normal, and having high aspirations was something that was made thinkable because it was talked about every day. Families also worked very hard economically to provide for their children, so lots of the parents were working incredibly long and antisocial hours in takeaways, for example, to try and get the money together to pay for example, extra tutoring or extra support.
That extra tutoring is interesting because there are a whole series of supplementary schools, I think you call them.
Yes. Most of the young people we talked to had actually been at some point to a Saturday school, a Chinese Saturday school, and these schools were kind of used partly to help children learn to speak Chinese or to write Chinese, but they were also valued by parents in particular as a way of helping young people to mix with other successful people or to get skills like language skills that they hoped would help them in their later lives. Yeah, it was talked about more in terms of being a successful British Chinese person. This is what you have to do, and families were very aware that they wouldn't just have to work hard, they'd have to work doubly or triply hard. There was an awareness of racism in society and an awareness that, that you have to work really hard in order to get on. Because
you were talking to teachers as well, weren't you,
yes,
about British Chinese students. You detected there examples of racism. Tell me about those.
We found that whilst all the teachers recognised and valued the very high achievement of the British Chinese young people that they taught, there was also some unwitting stereotyping going on. The pupils were often described as rather too quiet or perhaps not taking part enough in class, and the girls in particular were kind of described as sort of almost repressed by their families, which wasn't something that the young people themselves would agree with. I think it also reflects a kind of dominant mainstream notion of what the ideal pupil should be like, that there's this assumption that should you be questioning, should you be active, engaged. They're quite masculine middle-class traits and they don't always fit other people.
What about the issue of class here? Was it possible to say that class played a part in achievement, where working class British Chinese less likely to achieve than middle class British Chinese?
I think this is what was striking about the research. Whether pupils were from working class or middle class backgrounds, they all actually aspired to very middle class professional jobs, which is something you just don't tend to find, for example, in white middle class and working class samples. They'd often have quite different aspirations. Whilst the working class Chinese pupils would actually not always have the same cultural capital in the sense of access to the same sources of information, they would hold the same aspirations.
And what about gender? Did girls do better than boys?
They were both doing very well, actually, which again is an interesting contrast with the current debate.
Because we keep being told how well girls do, don't we, at
Yes.
the moment?
Yeah.
But you can't separate them in terms of their achievement.
No, overall, girls do tend to do better overall, but the difference is very, very small with the Chinese.
Do these young people who are being pushed so much by their families to achieve, are there some costs that have to be paid for this application?
Yes, well, we found across the sample, people talked about their experiences of racism. They experienced both overt racism, quite every day, and also quite subtle forms of cultural stereotyping. Lots of the boys would say, well, they get called Bruce Lee in the playground, and other boys try and fight them because it's assumed that they'll know martial arts. Whereas the girls would say that often other girls in the class would come up to them and try and make them perform Chineseness, so they'd get them to write Chinese or try and make them speak Chinese. And they really didn't enjoy this.
How are they coping with this? Were there some who seemed to you, when you talked to them, that almost their childhood had been taken away from them because of this determination by parents for them to be high achievers? Did any of them have doubts about what they were doing? Did some of them say, gosh, we wish we had some good times? No,
actually, parents and children tended to be in broad agreement. They all thought that they all valued education, they all thought it's important, and they all agreed that they wanted to get on in life, and they wanted to help both themselves and their families. Some of the young people said, well, we don't know why. For example, girls would say, well, we don't know why teachers would expect us to have to be out the whole time. What's wrong with working hard? And they would obviously do other things as well and be sociable and go to the gym and things like that. The only points of disagreement we did find were in relation to choice of future occupation. Mm. So whilst all the young people and their parents wanted them to go on to university, sometimes disagreements would arise where parents wanted them to follow particular, what they've called safe routes. So, for example, like medicine or doctor or accountancy, following in the steps of people who have gone before. Whereas some of the young people wanted to do slightly different things. So, for example, one girl wanted to be a designer. She desperately wanted to be a designer. And her mum was actually a designer. But her mum was saying to her, it's just too hard. There's too much racism. You'll find it too difficult, like I have. Don't be a designer. So the girl was quite upset about it, but she obviously recognised what her mum was saying.
I was talking there to Louise Archer.